From a galaxy far, far away point of view, one might come to the conclusion that the Michigan State Spartans have emerged from spring football as one of the worst and most disheveled and disorganized teams in the Big Ten. Now, obviously, that's from a galaxy far, far away point of view, and I think that's delusional, but from far away, it kind of makes sense. Some key players on defense and a key player on offense left in the spring portal period. Those are safety Jaden Mangham, defensive tackles Derek Harmon and Simeon Barrow Jr., and offensive guard Gino Van DeMark. They left for Michigan, Oregon, Miami, and Alabama, respectively. Three teams that I expect to be unanimously ranked in the coaches and AP top 25 for this coming season. They're all ranked in ESPN's FPI in their top 25, top 30 for power rankings. So some good players, not just garbage, which represented most of Michigan State's team last year. See Noah Kim, Caton Hauser, etc. But some good players, some all Big Ten caliber players, especially with Mangum, Harmon, and Barrow Jr. They left for other programs, and Mangum leaving for Michigan is a gut punch. I'd say it's the same thing with Harmon, who left for Oregon, who the Spartans are also playing in the month of October, much like the Michigan Wolverines on the road. But again, this is all from a very bird's eye, Mount Everest, distant point of view. I'm not claiming to be any insider, nor will I ever. It would be a privilege to gain that distinction. But I do think that I'm an analyst, and I do think I can read numbers. In fact, I know I'm capable of reading numbers and factoring in things such as staff upgrades and portal additions and things that are very important for college football. And I get the sense that I see something in Michigan State that many other people don't for this upcoming fall. And this isn't like me in 2023 or 2022 talking about how I thought that Michigan State would be an average, above average, maybe good team in that year, but still having questions about Tucker long term or questions about that specific team. I know that there's questions surrounding this team, but I think they have several strengths that could be maximized by a staff that could be one of the best in the Big Ten. Elite quarterback play could come out of that development, and in the long term, I think Jonathan Smith will help build Michigan State to be a physical developmental program that competes for Big Ten and, dare I say, national championships at East Lansing. So, do you have optimism for the fall, or do you think there's any optimism for the fall? Comment down below before we get started. And also, as a quick reminder, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell so that you can get notified when I release more college football content, especially as it relates to the Big Ten or season predictions. We're trying to hit 20,000 subscribers before the season begins. It's a very bold and big goal, but if we can do that, this channel will explode when this season kicks off, and I think it's going to explode regardless of whether we hit that goal or not. But we're here to talk about Michigan State football, not about my specific goals for the channel, though your subscription and hitting the notification bell, liking the video, and also commenting down below certainly help with that, and I'm going to do my best to reply to your comments as always. Also, if you want to go the extra mile and support the channel, please check out my Patreon page and my merchandise store via the link in the description or the pinned comment. You're not under any obligation or even a strong recommendation to do so. It's just if you want to, and I deeply appreciate any extra monetary support that you provide. If you do join my Patreon, when I advise people to visit my Patreon page, typically at the beginning or middle of every video, you'll see the names for my patrons for the specific month pop up, and they will be shouted out, potentially with your name if you join, at the end of every video. But thank you for listening to that, and for some of my very early thoughts and introduction to this topic. But where I really want to dive deep and dig into the dirt is talking about Michigan State's potential. When you hear the players that I mentioned departing the program, this also includes Bai Jobe, who was the highest-rated Michigan State recruit for the 2023 recruiting class. He's gone. He left for Kansas, by the way. Kansas. Now, I don't think he was probably going to be competing for a starting position this season. That's why I would expect him to move to Kansas or a different school that doesn't have the same talent on defense. Michigan State is not extremely talent rich by any means. They're not Penn State, they're not Michigan, Ohio State, Oregon. They're not even USC, though factoring in development, they might be infinitely more talented than USC on the defensive side of the ball. I love the Trojans staff, but it takes a while to undo the damage that Grinch did, especially when Riley only changed the defensive staff, not the strength and conditioning, not the overall model of the team. For State, Jonathan Smith and his staff are taking over a disaster from Mel Tucker, but they've cleaned house. And cleaning house sometimes allows you to get ahead of the curve in a way that a current regime changing some things here and there can't necessarily do. I'd look to Ohio State, USC, and even Iowa as classic examples of how just current coaching staffs changing assistants or coordinators does make big change, but if there's any problems with the head coach or the strength and conditioning or other issues, cleaning house gives you an ability to resolve those, that just making some changes here and there or repairing damaged parts, but not exactly changing the engine or the computer system of the program, I think you kind of get the point. And clearing house is risky. USC, Iowa, and Ohio State right now are programs with winning seasons. USC and Ohio State, as recently as 4 seasons ago, or 2 seasons ago for USC, appeared in their conference championship games. Iowa appeared in their conference championship game just last season. But for Michigan State, they've been terrible. 5-7 in 2022 and 4-8 last year. And even though Ohio State hasn't appeared in their conference championship game since 2020, they've been one of the best teams in the country every year since then. They've just ran into the Michigan roadblock. Michigan State beat Michigan in 2021, but hasn't exactly been competitive with them since. And they have not been competitive with Ohio State, not even with Penn State, who they also beat in 2021. And the hiring of Jonathan Smith, I think, was a message, a confirmation message sent by Alan Haller that he wanted to compete for championships. That's why they gave Tucker the famous and now forever mocked $95 million contract, which thankfully Michigan State got all the money that they hadn't already given Tucker in yearly payments. They got all of that back because Tucker violated the morality clause. At least that's how I remember, and I'm 99% sure that's how it worked. Very confident in that. And most of that money went to Smith's contract, his assistants, etc. Maybe even some NIL. Michigan State has been ahead of the curve compared to some other Big Ten programs in the space of NIL. But what I was talking about is, just kind of circling back to the topic, I got a little out there, but I think made some fairly good points, is Michigan State cleaned house. A part of that is mass transfers leaving, but some transfers that I think Michigan State fans, at least before the transfers occurred, would have preferred to keep these players, would have really wanted them to stay. I think Harmon, Mangum, Barrow are the key examples of that. And with how thin the offensive line looks to be, I think that Gino Vandemark or Ethan Boyd sticking around, some of these transfers are from even earlier, like the winter cycle, they would have certainly helped. But it is what it is, and most of these transfers departing the program, like let's say running back Jalen Berger, or every quarterback minus Sam Leavitt transferring away, really helped the program and just freed up scholarships to better players. Michigan State consequentially using those spaces to bring in transfers, some of whom are high caliber players, regardless if they're at the Power 4 or Group of 5 level. It's going to take me a while to get used to Power 4 and not Power 5. But anyway, I think that they have built themselves a good roster. And there's a lot of potential on this roster, both combining some returning players and also factoring in the incoming transfers. Michigan State last year did not have as good of a portal class as they did this season. Same thing with the year before that. Or even the year before that. Kenneth Walker was an elite player, but he was the only The only incoming portal success for Mel Tucker. The only one outside of, I think, maybe Jaden Reed. That was it. Those two players. And that's not good enough. That is not a way to be sustainable. And would a Kenneth Walker or Jaden Reed certainly help Michigan State's chances of coming out of nowhere and being a really good team this year, especially with the staff that has been assembled? Absolutely. But what's more important is 24 commits, 4 of them being recognized as high ceiling players. Other ones are highly ranked 3 stars per 24/7 Sports Portal rankings. And that means there's strength in numbers, there's strength in quality, there's bodies, and on top of that, factoring in special teams, offense, and defense, Michigan State returns 12 starters. They return 12 of them. I know on the offensive line, Brandon Baldwin is back. Running back Nate Carter is back. Chris Bogle at defensive end. Jordan Hall and Cal Halliday at linebacker. Dylan Tatum at safety. Malik Spencer at noseback. Or no, not noseback, nickelback. Pardon me. That was an old habit when I didn't even know what nickelback was. Just remove that from your memory. Ryan Eckley at punter, Jonathan Kim at kicker, and I believe, Alante Brown or Monterey Foster Jr. started at wide receiver, and Antonio Gates and Jaron Glover returned there as well. So while there's no position that's immediately eye-popping as elite, like let's say Ohio State's safety room or Michigan's defensive line, or at quarterback for, let's say, Georgia this coming season, or there's no position that has the depth of Ohio State or Texas's quarterback room or Georgia's tight end room, where they print awesome tight ends and also bring in Benjamin Urasek, who's awesome. There's not any room that necessarily pops out like those do immediately. Part of that's headlines, part of that's looking through the numbers and admitting, no, Michigan State's not necessarily elite anywhere. But potential's potential, and elite staffs can raise up a team's floor and ceiling to where, with a less talented roster, because of their superior development, a team that is as talented as Michigan State can be somewhat dominant. At times, though this is an exception to the rule, they can be very dominant, and they can compete with teams that have much higher talent than they do. Why has Oklahoma State and TCU over the past decade beaten Texas like a drum? Because they've, on average, have had better staffs, even though Texas has recruited better. Now, of course, when Steve Sarkisian and his staff came around, even though Mike Gundy is still at Oklahoma State and Sonny Dykes has kind of brought back TCU from where Gary Patterson destroyed them, because of the good coaching of Sarkisian and the talent, Texas is, on average, going to beat schools like Oklahoma State and TCU, though they won't play them yearly anymore, of course. But that's really beside the point, because this is year 1 of a program. We haven't seen how Jonathan Smith has recruited yet at Michigan State, and he's one of the best in terms of development and schematics. And him bringing Mike McDonald, Oregon State's strength and conditioning coach, and an assistant strength and conditioning coach with Smith at Washington, that's awesome. He's one of the best in the country. I can guarantee you that. And with Aiden Childs, Jack Velling, and Tanner Miller transferring in from Oregon State, 3 players that know Smith, know his coaches, know the system. Those will be all Big Ten caliber players with the Spartans. Also, pay attention to Luke Newman coming in from Holy Cross. Elite offensive lineman at the FCS level. Will it transition to the Power 4? Big jump, but Newman was top 10 according to Pro Football Focus in terms of offensive tackle ratings. And Michigan State returns 61% of their production from last year. That's just high enough to where you have some experience and some roster cohesion, but also enough production leaving to where there's definitely some weeds that have been pulled out and there's been good fruit and good trees that have been planted within the program. Or at least that's what you would hope, and I think you can give benefit of the doubt there to Jonathan Smith. And I think that with the staff that's coming in, they will capitalize on all of these things that I think go in their favor. High ceiling players transferring in, some bodies transferring in, like Ed Woods, for example, at corner transferring in from Arizona State. Not an awesome player, but played in the Pac-12 last season, had an interception, a few passes defended, a few forced fumbles, including one against Washington, where Arizona State played the runner-ups very closely in a 15-7 final score in favor of the Huskies. He's an example of a player who I don't think is high ceiling. No disrespect to him. He's a better corner than I could ever be and will ever be. But he certainly helps the secondary depth, and being a projected starter means that he's definitely upgraded Michigan State's defensive back room. He's projected to start ahead of Charles Brantley. So there's some competition there from the incoming transfers, whether they're going to be elite players, near elite, great, good, above average, average, maybe even bad. Depth is being added, and that's raising the average level of play, the ceiling, and the floor of this team. But let's dive even deeper to the next layer of the onion and discuss some strengths more specifically, including some numbers, which is always fun. I think running backs and linebackers, when you study this team, jump out as immediate areas of strengths. Running back has some questionable depth, but they have two proven players who also have a lot of seniority. And at linebacker, Michigan State is either going to be running a 4-2-5 or 4-3, I believe, under Joe Rossi, and there are 3 starting caliber linebackers, or at least 4 linebackers with starting experience. Because I don't know how Wayne Matthews III or Halliday would how they would do at a good, respectable Power 4 program in terms of starting. I'm confident that a Turner and Jordan Hall would do well at most other Power 4 linebacker rooms. For example, I'm a Michigan fan. I would have loved to nag Jordan Hall in the transfer portal to get him to come to Ann Arbor, because I think Michigan does need depth at linebacker. But alas, that didn't happen. And some other areas of strength that I would pay attention to are quarterback, tight end, offensive center. That's where the Oregon State transfers have came into effect, and I trust them a lot because I trust Jonathan Smith and his staff. And I've watched Oregon State, in fact, multiple Oregon State games from last year, because I thought they could be a college football playoff team in the 2023 preseason. And that didn't age well, but they finished top 20 in FPI, had one of the higher ceilings and more dominant trenches in the Pac-12. I just think the lack of defensive production they returned entering 2023 bit them in the butt, against Washington State surrendering the 38 points, so on and so forth. Similar story to Joe Rossi at Minnesota and why their defense faltered last year, which is why I'm not extremely worried about that 1 year compared to his previous 2 in 21 and 22 when he fielded top 10 defenses at Minnesota. Joe Rossi was definitely a good hire and a good complement to the mostly Pac-12 offensive staff that Smith brought into East Lansing from Corvallis. Offensive guard, defensive tackle, and defensive end, depending on how many of those transfer additions go right, those also could be areas of strength. So if everything goes right, which is rare, but having a elite staff, which I think Michigan State does, and I think most would be hard-pressed to agree with me when confronted with the evidence and what Oregon State has done over the previous 2-3 seasons under Smith, including his history and some of his staff's history at prior stops, an elite staff gives you a better chance for everything to go right. If everything goes right, this probably isn't a top 10 team, not even top 15, but Michigan State isn't looking for that in year one. That would be awesome, but with a very tough schedule and Mel Tucker, well, frankly, ruining the program, for lack of a better term, as much or even more than Mark D'Antonio did. Especially, you think that it's pretty funny when a lot of the successful players, particularly on defense and the offensive line, and even wide receiver, because Reed was at one point recruited by D'Antonio, they were all not Mel Tucker. They were all Mark D'Antonio recruits, and the Mel Tucker recruits kind of flamed out. I don't know about Simeon Barrow, but I think that he may have been originally recruited by D'Antonio, and then Mel Tucker kept him, reined in or reeled in, preventing him from going to another school. I don't exactly know. But the point that I'm trying to make is that They could be a top 25 team. They could maybe even be a top 20 team if everything goes right and they can shock people. And I think they can with some of these strengths, especially given that running back's important in the Big Ten and linebacker is the quarterback of the defense, as Jason Hewlett, Michigan linebacker, has famously put on my channel, and it's something I've heard before, and I'm just going to use that from now on with total confidence. So two important positions, especially in this conference, and Michigan State's strong at them. Nathan Carter and Kayron Lynch-Adams combined for almost 2,000 rushing yards last year, 1,955 to be exact. They had 16 rushing touchdowns, and they averaged 4.6 yards per carry. And UMass and Michigan State are not known, or at least have not been known, for their offensive line play or just having good offenses at all. They had some of the worst offenses in the country last season. And now, Jonathan Smith, an offensive mastermind, has also brought a group of masterminds in his staff with him, including Brian Lindgren, his offensive coordinator, and great tight end and offensive line coaches from Oregon State, great wide receivers coaches. He retained Courtney Hawkins, who's Michigan State's wide receivers coach under Mel Tucker. And Oregon State staff, look, they were just so good. They were so good last year and in 2022 as well, when they finished 10-3, competing with USC, competing with Washington. It could have easily that year went 11-1. And last year they could have also flirted with the college football playoff. On the offensive line, look, I think that there, with Jim Malchizik, the offensive line coach, run game coordinator, I think they're set there, especially since Oregon State, I think, just produced a first-round offensive lineman in the NFL draft, or at least a day 2 selection, if not first round. And then Brian Wozniak at tight end, decent recruiter, good recruiter, I'd say by Oregon State standards, in Corvallis, where he was the recruiting coordinator, developed awesome tight ends such as Jack Velling. And in the 2023 NFL draft, they put out another tight end. I forget his name. He wasn't used a lot. Luke Musgrave. Yes, for the Packers. And he's had several hundred receiving yards with the Packers. So this staff is awesome. And particularly in the trenches and physical positions like O-line and tight end, Nathan Carter and Kayron Lynch-Adams finally getting a at least respectable offensive line, I think, would do wonders for their capabilities of attacking defenses on the ground. At linebacker, you have Wayne Matthews III, you have Jordan Turner, you have Jordan Hall, and you have Cal Halliday. You also have Darius Snow as well, but I didn't really include him. He has another year to develop. He's currently listed as a second stringer and wasn't as good as Cal Halliday, so I didn't count him necessarily as a fully starting caliber player, but he's had starting and playing experience as well, so that helps. This room is deep. Last season, these 4 players combined for 354 tackles, 12 sacks, 5 forced fumbles, 6 passes defended, and a pick. 12 sacks divided by 4, that's an average of 3 sacks per player, definitely more pressures as well, an average of 1 forced fumble per player. Hall was a true freshman last year. Another year of development behind a better staff, especially better strength and conditioning. He'll add more muscle, more speed. I'm just trying to get you prepared that this team is better than what, for example, ESPN's FPI is projecting. Now, FPI is often right on a lot of things, especially at the end of the year, but at the beginning of the year, their rankings are rather wonky. They think that Michigan State is the 17th best team in the Big Ten, which, while I don't think Michigan State is certainly top 6 or top 7, even top 8, being 17th, I think, is a heap of garbage when you look at the incoming portal class and some of the strengths of this team. Halliday was the only one of these 4 who had an interception. I think, and this is just intuition mostly, I think Jordan Turner and Jordan Hall were more so edge or outside linebacker players, while Halliday was like playing center fielder, basically, middle linebacker, from my understanding. But again, could be wrong. I'm always open to correction, but that's what it looks like on the depth chart. That's what I remember from last season. Quarterback with Aiden Childs, he threw for a few hundred yards last year, had a QBR that's in the 80s, that's very efficient. Not like close to perfect like Joe Burrow, Mac Jones, or Tua Tagovailoa in college, or Jaden Daniels last season, or even J.J. McCarthy for much of last season. But it's darn good, especially for a true freshman. At tight end with Jack Velling, he was great. Offensive center with Tanner Miller, I think he'll be one of the best, if not the best, centers in the Big Ten this season. Luke Newman at offensive guard. I've mentioned him before, but top 10 according to PFF. Pay attention to him. I'm interested in seeing how right guard turns out, with Christian Phillips being projected to start according to ourlads.com. And offensive tackle with Brandon Baldwin and Ashton Lepo and Stanton Ramil behind Lepo, according to ourlads.com. I wonder how the offensive line will be. This could be a unit that is bad yet again. Not terrible, but just bad. Or they could be really good. There's a wide range of outcomes, I think, for the offensive line. And I think scheme will have a huge part in whether maybe some of their weaknesses are hidden and or strengths maximized. Defensive tackle, this is an interesting spot for Michigan State. Harmon and Barrow leave, but Maverick Hansen comes back. He's a redshirt senior, older player, full of seniority, and he was good last year. Michigan State's defensive tackle core is one of the most wasted points of the entire Mel Tucker era. Even go back to 2021 when Jacob Slade and Panashuk were on that defensive line, along with also Simeon Barrow Jr. That was one of the best defensive lines in the country in retrospect. You want to know why they were never recognized? Because their secondary sucked and their defensive coordinator sucked. And their offense that year was awesome, but in following seasons, again, wasn't good because their offensive coordinator sucked and their head coach was terrible. But Hansen comes back full of experience. He's projected to start along with incoming transfer Daquan Deuce. And at defensive end, Quindarius Dunnigan is projected to start along with Chris Bogle. Jalen Thompson, who played as a true freshman last year, and Ken Tolley are backing them up at defensive end. Ben Roberts, Jaden Satchel, Alex Van Summeren, and Raquan Buckley are backing up the defensive tackle position. And Tyler Gillison and Anthony Jones are the third stringers at defensive end. So this room, even with all the departing production there and talent, especially with Barrow, I think I projected him to be a second team all Big Ten player this year, one of the better defensive tackles in the conference. And that includes Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant, Ty Hamilton, Tyleik Williams. Even Michigan's third stringer at the position, Rashawn Benny, might be one of the better defensive tackles in the country. Michigan's deep at that position. Don't forget about Aaron Graves at Iowa, for example. Penn State returns all the defensive tackles. I had Barrow up there, above many of those players mentioned, so losing him hurts a lot. But Jonathan Smith and Joe Rossi and that staff did a really good job of stacking players there. And if all of them turn out, who's to say that this couldn't be a strength of the team, both defensive end and defensive tackle? So I think the Spartans have a lot of strengths to them, and two of them, especially at running back and linebacker, are glaring to me. In the long run, I'm putting all my chips in the middle of the table for Michigan State and Jonathan Smith. I'm a huge believer in him, and I think his resume backs up my faith and others' faith in him. Of course, you never know. Scott Frost, Will Muschamp, Tom Herman. I mean, these are great hires, what were viewed as great hires at the time, and they just spiraled out of control. Just circled the drain toilet, the urinal drain, whatever you want to call it. Just didn't turn out well. But that's the risk you take when you hire a new head coach, is you don't know if things are going to improve. Heck, things can even get worse when you fire a coach and bring on someone new. Brady Hoke was viewed as a upgrade to Rich Rodriguez, and I'd argue at the end of the Brady Hoke tenure, it was worse than at the end of the Rich Rod tenure, and the Rich Rod tenure was pretty bad. Jim Harbaugh nearly got fired from Michigan It was basically a win over Rutgers, or maybe begging Ward Manuel, that saved his job in 2020. And then Michigan went on a 40-3 run and won it all. But Jonathan Smith, 34-35 record at Oregon State, which is pretty good in Corvallis. And in the past 2 years, he is 18-7. 18-7. And the past 2 years, the Pac-12 have been some of the conference's stronger seasons in, ironically and sadly, some of their final years. And both the 22 and 23 Beavers as well were top 25 in both ESPN's FPI and Bill Connolly's SP Plus rankings. Combining both of them at the end of the year would produce pretty reliable results in my mind. Those were good teams with less talent outside of the top 50 compared to Michigan State, who, again, is not the most talented team or even close to that in the Big Ten, but they have top 40, top 30 talent, and they've recruited inside of the top 20 before, even under Mark D'Antonio, and I think maybe once or at points during their recruiting cycles under the Mel Tucker regime. Smith has built a staff that I think is comparable to the 4 favorites to win the Big Ten. I think it's comparable to Ohio State's, to Michigan's, to Oregon's. I think it's better than Penn State's. And that's mostly because of James Franklin being on that staff. But even taking out all the head coaches, it's comparable to all of those staffs. It really is. Rossi is one of the better coordinators in the Big Ten in the country. I don't think that he's Jim Knowles, but you can't necessarily say that he's automatically worse than Tom Allen. I think by resume, he's better than Tosh Lupoy at the position. You could compare him to D'Anton Lynn in the way that they fixed defenses at inferior schools by talent ranking relatively quickly. Lynn at UCLA, Rossi did it at Minnesota. And Brian Lindgren combined with Smith, they've produced offenses that are really good at running the football, good at being physical. And Lindgren, I mean, is he really worse than Kirk Campbell at Michigan? Is he worse than Chip Kelly at Ohio State? I mean, Chip Kelly's offense at UCLA last year was not good, despite having highly talented pieces. And Oregon State's, while inconsistent at times, I mean, DJ Uiagalelei did much better at Oregon State than he did at Clemson, despite having far less talent in terms of recruiting rankings. Is he worse than Andy Kotelnicki? I think so, but that's one of the few I could put ahead of Lindgren, along with Oregon's Will Stein. So this staff, I'm telling you, is really good. And then Mike McDonald is one of the best strength and conditioning coaches in the country. If you don't believe me, Oregon State under Jonathan Smith has had good defenses compared to the rest of the Pac-12's average, and they've had better trench play and better development relative to their talent compared to most Pac-12 teams. It's a sign of a good strength and conditioning coach, especially when a team is continuing to progress in an upward direction as the strength and conditioning coach, who's arguably the second in command to the head coach as he manages and trains the team during the preseason and when practices aren't happening, during winter, spring, and workouts whenever, when he has more time to train everyone, and when all of the players on the team have been trained by him, that's when he gets to maximize the talent and the potential of the roster. I expect Michigan State to be physical, competitive, and I do think that they will go bowling this season. Is that a guarantee? I don't think it's a guarantee, but I'm fairly confident that the Spartans will go bowling. In fact, I say that I'm fairly confident that they will have a winning record. At least that's more likely than a losing record. It's more likely, in my opinion, for them to go 7-5 than 5-7. And that's with a schedule that's tough. I mean, they play Ohio State, they play Oregon, they play Michigan, they play Rutgers and Iowa teams that return a lot of their production and I think made upgrades, whether through their returning production or for Iowa through abandoning the idea of nepotism, for example. And I still think that because of the staff and because of some of the players they've brought in and even some that they've returned, they'll steal a win, quote unquote, that many, including perhaps myself, won't expect them. I'd look at Iowa for that, for example. Rutgers is another team who I think will be better than Michigan State, but they could absolutely beat. Michigan, they lose a lot. It's a rivalry game. You never know. Oregon is the one game that I look at, and it being on the road and also after Ohio State, I'd give the least likely chance for Michigan State to do anything in that game. But again, Jonathan Smith has played Dan Lanning for 2 years in a row, beat him in 2022, probably would have been more competitive last year if not for Jonathan Smith looking ahead to the job in East Lansing. And Ohio State, they have questions about their offensive line. And I'd say they have questions about their offense, period, after last year. So if the defense plays at full capacity and Michigan State plays one of the best games the previous 4 seasons of the 2020s, maybe something insane can happen. I'm not saying that will happen, though. I expect 6-6, 7-5, maybe, although this is where I begin to doubt myself, maybe 8-4. That's the range that I think this team will fall in. They'll upset one team, maybe more, that is superior to them in what should be a 2007 type season. This is going to be a very down year in college football. When everyone's down, no one's down, and that shouldn't take away from a team winning the national championship or winning their conference. But according to ESPN's FPI, Georgia is the number 1 team in the country. They have a 26.8 FPI rating. That is the lowest rating for the number 1 team in the country since 2007. And in 2007, the best team in the country per ESPN's FPI, this is just loading here. I think it was either USC, maybe LSU. No, it was Oklahoma, who had 3 losses. USC was behind them at number 2, LSU behind them at number 3, and LSU won the national title that year, being the only national champion with 2 losses of the 21st century. This is going to be a down year in football. I think it'll be very similar to 2021. That means either maybe everyone has 2 losses at the end of the regular season like 2007, or maybe you get what happened last year just due to the fact that college football is maybe very top heavy and you have almost 10 or more teams that only have 1 loss, and many, or some of them are even undefeated. And at that point, some 9-3 teams that people would say, oh, absolutely, this maybe 9-3 Michigan would absolutely get in. Or if Michigan State were to do the unthinkable and go 9-3, oh, with their tough schedule, they'd get in. And maybe even some 10-2 teams are left out. This season is going to be chaotic, and good staffs take advantage of chaotic situations. Thank you all so much for watching this video. Remember to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. Thanks to Crash2488 for being a Heisman member in the month of May. Thanks to Spencer Bringhurst, Chris Lane, and Connor Little OH for being All-American members in the month of May. And thanks to Will Loftus, John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, and Janisha Cockrell for being All-Conference members in the month of May. Have a great day, guys, and I will see you all soon. Bye-bye.